Hi, all. My name is DT, and welcome to the other side. Big welcome to our freshly joined and older viewers, and welcome Hope Reese, who is the author of the book The Women Are Not Fine, which is about a Hungarian case, a very big case and a pretty unknown case. And I'm really excited to talk about it with Hope Reese.
Hey there, thank you for having me today.
It's a pleasure. Would you be so kind to introduce yourself to our viewers?
I'd love to. I am an American journalist and I've been living in Budapest for the last 7 years. I'm a freelance writer, write for the New York Times and other papers. And for the last several years, I've been working on this story, The Women Are Not Fine.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's so amazing that a person like you is interested in Hungarian cases, and I would really love to know, how did you find this story and what captivated you?
Yes. First, should I give a quick summary of what actually happened there?
Yeah, I think
Okay,
it's good.
so for those who aren't familiar, this story, The Women Are Not Fine, it tells the story of a midwife in the early 1900s in a Hungarian village called Nagyrév, which I'm not the expert at producing that sound,
Mhm,
Nagyrév, but she lived in Nagyrév and she listened to women who were talking about problems at home. A lot of the problems had to do with their husbands. So, as a midwife, she was the doctor in the village. She had a knowledge of herbs and remedies. Um, she was entrusted into these people's lives. And when she heard a lot of the stories, she would say, "Why do you bother with him?" And she would offer them what she called a solution, which
mhm,
came in the form of arsenic,
mhm,
and would offer them the arsenic. They would put it droplets into their husband's porridge, brandy, palanca, everything, and slowly they would die over the course of a day or several days, sometimes weeks.
mhm,
So it started as a small scale poisoning ring, you would say, but it actually spiraled into something much bigger. And by 1929, when the authorities finally found the women, there were 28 people in the village on trial for more than 100 murders. But some experts say that hundreds of people in the region may have died. So that's what happened.
mhm.
It's a pretty incredible story, and as a female-led mass poisoning, it's really the top in the 20th century. I couldn't find any other parallels. Okay, how did I find out about it?
Mhm.
I visited Budapest for the first time in the spring of 2018. And at the time, I was living in Louisville, Kentucky. I was a freelancer, as I still am, and I just was really curious about the city, wanting to get away and wanting to experience it, but I didn't know anybody. I didn't know much about Hungary or Budapest at all. And on one of my early days here, I met a guy with Hungarian ancestry. I met him at an open mic night. He told me a family story, which was just incredible. It blew my mind. He told me that his Hungarian grandmother had poisoned her husband, which was his father. She ended up in jail for 25 years. She didn't successfully kill him, but she was in jail. And the story was interesting to me because I wondered, okay, how did this affect his father, his siblings when their mom is in jail? And he said, oh, Hungarian women have been poisoning their husbands for centuries, and look into the case called the Angel Makers.
Mhm.
So anyway, this set me on a path. As we've said, I'm an American journalist, so the whole process of finding out what happened was heavily dependent on help from Hungarians, translators. I worked with a researcher, looked at the archives, talked to people. Anyway, this is how I came to this story.
Hmm. It's really fascinating, and I must say that I really envy you for getting your hands on those archives. It must have been really great work, I think. So, what struck you the most when you first encountered the Nagyrév case, and what disturbed you the most after deeper research?
Mhm. So, for the last decade, I've been covering stories related to women, to gender. Um, it fell under the umbrella of the things that I've been really interested in.
Hmm.
And what struck me the most at first was just the fact that so many women killed so many men,
Hmm.
because typically it goes the other way around. If we look at domestic homicide figures, it's like 9 to 1 that the males are the perpetrators and women are the victims.
Hmm.
So then, how did this happen, and how did it happen at such a large scale? How did it happen over 20 years? I found this all really fascinating. Is there a different way that women kill, a different motivation? There are a lot of questions that came up for me. And initially, like many of the readers, actually afterwards they'll say, why did they do it? I had the question at first. It's much too simplistic in a sense to there's no simple answer for that question.
Hmm.
If we want to broadly generalize, that's kind of like the title. Well, why did they do it? They were not fine. The women were not fine, clearly. But domestic violence, unfortunately, it was a force that pretty much all of these women fell under in some way. A lot of the stories had to do with abusive husbands and a kind of need to escape. However, that doesn't mean that all of them had those stories. There were a lot of different reasons. There were factors. There was World War I that happened,
Hmm.
and the trauma that resulted from that. There were economic forces, societal forces. So there isn't one single answer. But that was the kind of driving force. Why? The why. As I started writing it, I just realized more and more how a whole host of ingredients can come together. And in a way, after doing the research and looking at all these forces, it ends up making some, not sense, but you can a bit more understand. Well, yeah, of course, when this and this and this are all put together, they do result in violence. And
Hmm.
the violence that was experienced from the war, the violence that was experienced at home, results in violence towards, again, the men
Hmm.
afterwards.
Yeah, yeah, it's a very interesting thing to talk about, like what motivated the women to do this heinous act. And, when we hear about domestic violence, it's usually about two people, so it's individual trauma. But somehow I feel that it's kind of the system's fault. I'm not sure if this is the correct phrasing for it, but I would like you to try to answer to my next question, which is how important is it to shift the focus from individual acts to the systems that made those acts imaginable?
So this plays out in two different ways in this story. If we look at the murders themselves, if we look at how they spiraled into an epidemic, it's clear that this group element is very important. So in the book, I have a whole character tree, up front,
Yeah.
readers can see. And that was actually not very easy to put together because there's so many, there are top level. We have the midwife who is distributing poison. She's talking about it. She's very open. But there are also some older women in the village who have been poisoning even before the midwife,
Hmm.
and they have their own motivations. Also, they were very motivated. Rosalia Takac, one woman who was beaten by her husband for nearly 3 decades. And her story is very moving. She went on to help a whole series of women who had also been going through some form of abuse. Anyway, the point is, the more that women poison people, it wasn't just husbands, by the way. Sometimes it was mother-in-laws, father-in-laws. The majority were husbands, but not everybody. But the more that they started using poisoning as a method and talking about it, the more they normalized it. So
Hmm.
here's where that group element comes in. You begin to shift what is acceptable. Our social world is so influential in forming our ideas of what's normal and what's acceptable in a
Hmm.
community. Okay, so I described the kind of groupthink that contributed to the poisonings, but then there is the way that we look at blame, which is that's
Hmm.
your question. So, it's always a blend of the individual and the societal. I tend to see things a bit more on the societal level.
Hmm.
These acts, These acts come in a social context. They come out of somewhere. They are related to each poisoning is also related to the poisoning that happened next door. It's related to the village. It's related to the country. It's related to the legal systems in place. It's related to the fact that the pastor in the village, who was pretty much the most important person, was failing at his job and he didn't listen. He didn't notice. He didn't get involved. There was no police force there that was protecting people, men or women, from any of this. And so those failures are part of why this happened. And during the trials, the judge tended to look at these women as outliers. There's no way they could be seen as full women because they did such an unwomanly thing by murdering. So instead, they were labeled as witches, as beasts, as monsters. And in this way, he put this onus on the individual. He took away any kind of implication that things at a larger scale weren't working. Clearly, at a larger scale, things were not working. So while we might look at the acts and say this was, they were heinous acts, and the whole idea of whether they were justified is separate. However, they can't be removed from the society.
Hmm. Yeah, I like what you said about blaming. I can't see these poisonings as crimes, like individual crimes. I see it more like a social rebellion. Yeah, and also blaming, back to blaming, because when I first met with this case, I was like,
Ah, poor women. They had to resort to poisoning because they were so abused and
but on the other side, men are the real victims here. Okay, they were abusive. They had PTSD from World War One, and alcoholism was a thing. And this does not excuse them from beating their wives, of course. But if you think about it, I think it was a social rebellion more like than a crime or a series of crimes.
Right. And so with the word rebellion, I think of trying to free yourself from an oppressor. And in that sense, yes, I think many of them were.
Hmm.
Again, tricky about generalizing to everybody. I think part of it is that they didn't see them as murder. When we look
Hmm.
at the testimony, they used language like, I put him to sleep, I put him to rest, I helped him.
Hmm.
And the more I think about the language, of course, it's a way for them to exonerate themselves and get themselves morally off of the hook of committing the crime. But I think some of them believed that. I believe that some of them thought they actually were helping. They were able to kind of do these mental gymnastics.
Hmm.
But the other part is the men were really suffering. And the victims were largely, they were men and they were older people. They were people that society deemed useless. They were people who, in a society where everybody had a role and the role was important, the marriages were not for love, they were for economic purposes. There was a saying like equal land marries equal land in
Hmm.
Hungarian.
Hmm.
And it's very important to remember this because I believe those men who came back from the war, some of them really didn't want to live much longer. This is a whole separate thing, doesn't justify it, but there are cases in here where the veterans who were enduring, prisoner of war camps, whatever they went through, physical or mental, many of them were so scarred at the end. Some of them said, I wish I had died at the war.
Hmm.
So it just paints a portrait of a community of suffering. And I think it's important to remember that whether it's a rebellion or not, for the women, I think they saw this as like the only way out,
Hmm.
or like a natural order of things. Okay, I have a problem. Here's how I handle it. They had a kind of cold, hard look at things. Infanticide was common then too, which is something I wasn't aware of, but there was no birth control. So a lot of women resorted to killing infants. And this was so widespread that the men also they were part of this as well. No one was judging the women for doing that because they had to do that.
Hmm.
So what they were faced with was pretty awful, and rebellion is part of it, but I think survival is the biggest part of it.
Yeah, I have a question about blaming. When I've read about the court documents and all the things, I have the feeling that everybody's blaming the women. Like you said, they are monsters, they are witches, they are beasts, and so on. They are not ladylike or anything. And I was wondering if Nagyrév, that this case happened today, would we recognize it or would we still blame the women?
It's a great question, and I think the way that we respond to acts of crime says more about our culture and our values at the time than it does about necessarily what happened, because again, it doesn't happen in a bubble. So
Hmm.
at that time, the women were portrayed as, what we said, beasts, monsters. Many of them were illiterate, and that point was really played up during the trials. So they were very much judged for that. Today, it wouldn't be as correct to call the women monsters. There would be some people who would be a bit angrier about it. Now we have a consciousness and awareness. And it doesn't mean those terms aren't used. Witch hunt is used by politicians, it's used by
Yeah.
presidents. That term has not gone out, that term has not become extinct yet, which is
Yeah.
crazy to me. So women still are seen in a certain way, but today we have better language for understanding it. But it really comes down to not just today, but which country are we talking about? And even if you go to a country, if you go to the United States, which state, which city, what are the who's in charge there, and how do they frame what happened?
Hmm.
It must have been easier at that time, I believe, to hide the murders. Okay, there are no cell phones, there's no
Camera.
videos. Yes, of course they knew what was happening, but those villages were really isolated.
Hmm.
Today, the world is a lot more connected. So if something did, it doesn't mean that these things couldn't go undetected, and I do think it happens. However, I think there's a much stronger connection between the village and the outside world.
Hmm. Yeah, I think you see it very correctly. Yeah, internet is a big help. There were several serial killers in the 60s, 70s, and 80s, but after internet and cameras, like surveillance exploded, we have less and less serial killers because they get caught before even becoming a serial killer, for example. But I find the title really intriguing. I actually love it. So the women are not fine. And it's almost deceptively simple. So I would like to know, what does the title really mean to you? And why did you choose this title?
Thank you. I love the title as well, and it was we went through many different ideas of what the title could be before landing on this one, and it comes from a quote from a woman in Nagyrév who I interviewed about the story. Who she of course was she came to Nagyrév, decades after this whole case. But she could remember like as a teenager, kids teasing her on the bus about, you came from a poisoning village. And there's still a sense there for her of being defined by that story. She told me when she was speaking about women today in Hungary, the women are not fine.
Hmm.
So she was kind of drawing parallels to the then and now. I think when most people pick up the book, they think, rightly so, it refers to those women 100 years ago. And I find it interesting that some parts of the story remain the same over a century. Some things change and some core things haven't completely changed. So parts of this, those women, it's interesting when I found this out, those women could have divorced. They
Hmm.
had that legal right, so even though it's 100 years ago, it actually doesn't mean they had no rights. That illustrates even more strongly to me the fact that we can't take our rights for granted. It's about those people enforcing it. It's about the people around. It's about how does our government treat us? How do we have systems in place to care for people who are being abused
Mhm.
at every level, at the veteran level, at the domestic violence level. They didn't have a term for that at the time. Domestic violence wasn't even a thing. And one of the quotes in the book is, maybe you can say it better, as asszony vérvio.
Az asszony verve jó.
Thank you. It means a wife is good when beaten,
Yeah.
right? This is an old term, but I heard it from a woman, a Hungarian friend of mine today, in this day and age. So although these old terms exist, that idea that, a beating is common, a beating is acceptable, those ideas can last for a very, very long time. In that culture, it was acceptable. It wasn't out of the ordinary. You couldn't get a divorce for a quote unquote light beating.
Mm-hmm.
You had to really have your life almost in jeopardy.
Mm-hmm.
And it just shows how far we have to go to protect people who are in danger. So anyway, I like the title too. Not fine can mean a very broad range of things. I would say these women are very, very not fine. But it's always good to kind of question and push up against the reasons why we're not fine today.
I really love the title "The Women Are Not Fine" because it somehow makes me think that these are the words that came out of the mouth of the judge or authorities. Like, yeah, this whole thing is because the women are not fine. And they didn't have a look at the background, I think. And this is why your book is so fantastic, because it shows many point of views on the whole thing that went down. And I just love it that it's not black and that it's not white, but it's more like a middle ground, a gray, and I really love it. So I have a very difficult question. How does collective female suffering differ from individual trauma in the way it's remembered or erased?
So if we look at your question, removing the female part, but just looking at collective versus individual trauma, there's a psychological principle that we are able to pay attention to like an individual in a better way than we are to a greater number of people. This is why, for instance, news articles are framed, even if it's about a war or a massacre or a mass shooting, we look at the one killer, the one victim, we zoom in because our psyche, we cannot handle these huge numbers. When we hear of thousands of people being killed in Iran or wherever, it's actually hard to conceive of that, right? So looking at individuals helps. And in a sense, the more, the greater numbers, sometimes it gets a bit blurred and lost. And when we look at female suffering and female deaths, we do view them differently. I read a really interesting book called Dead Girls, which looks at the idea of the female victim. And again, the same way that our society views killing as an unnatural act for a woman, almost on the flip side, it views being killed as a more kind of natural act. We glamorize the dead woman, right? So in films, in TV, it often opens with a dead woman. She's the kind of glamorous, beautiful person. And in her dead state, that makes some sense in a certain way. When we look at collective female suffering, we still don't value this, right? The same way because we still don't see women as truly people. That might sound like an extreme take on it, but we are not seen as equals. Our deaths are not viewed the same way. We're not taken quite as seriously. So, collective female suffering, we can get behind it. Well, maybe we'll talk about this the next one, but Me Too. When women come together for, okay, not at this level of suffering, but when women have been heard at a mass level, it doesn't mean their voices can't be heard. But I truly don't think the voices are heard as loudly or taken as seriously as when it is a whole group of men. This also, it's about power. We also don't see suffering the same way when we look at citizens of a third world country or people who are poor, people who are Black. There are all these different ways that we view people in society and we give them value. And so being a woman carries a certain kind of value. So do these other signifiers.
Wow, great thoughts. I love it really much. And I love that you brought up the Me Too movement, because this is what I was thinking about, that this Nagyrév poisoning thing was almost like a Me Too movement in itself. Like we had Aunt Juji, the midwife, and oh, come on, I will listen to your everyday problems. Okay, here's the arsenic, go do yourself a favor. And then me too, me too, me too, me too. But obviously it's absolutely different thing than the Me Too movement was itself, but it's also about abuse, so it's not that far-fetched, I think. Do you think we are any better today at offering women real exits, or just better narratives?
So it's a tricky question as well, because like, who is we and where are we? If we look at, for instance, I'll take the United States as an example. Over the decades in the 1900s and up until pretty recently, I think recently things are hard to judge from a broad perspective because everything's happening so quickly. However, for a very long time with the women's movements, there became an awareness. Domestic violence became something that was codified in language. There were laws against it. There were structures in place, shelters in place for women who have been abused. This awareness does go a long way, and it does not by any means mean that those things don't happen or that it's not difficult, but there are still ways to get out that are an improvement over how it used to be. The public acceptability for beating, for all these things, that's no longer acceptable, right?
Yeah.
However, sorry, I had one more thought about this. My brain.
Sorry.
No. Oh yeah. When we look at rape or domestic violence that happens in that way, we didn't have a law against that act until the 90s, the late 90s, I believe. It's incredible.
Yeah.
That is a violent act that could go unpunished.
Yeah, for such a
So
long
this
time.
is in our lifetime, it really isn't that far away. So change can take a long time, is what I'm trying to say. Basically, yes, there are avenues out, there are routes out, but all these other things matter. The color of your skin matters, your level of wealth matters, where you were born and raised matters. You have to take that all into the picture. And so there are avenues out, but it doesn't necessarily mean that those are feasible, that those are accessible.
What do you think would it mean to truly listen to the stories like Nagyrév without sensationalizing them?
Right. This is tricky because during the trials, the media coverage, the local coverage was very sensationalistic. It was kind of like a tabloid. And so it wasn't only the judge, but it was the way the stories were framed by the press. And those did have an impact on how people perceived them. The trials were a spectacle. People, paid money for the tickets. They waited in line for tickets to see what was going on. And when it comes to telling the stories, if you now come back to the present day as I'm writing it, there are, women who want to sensationalize it the other way, or not just women, but there are people who want to say,
oh, they killed those bastards. They deserved it.
That's going too far. I don't want any of the listeners today to come away thinking that I'm advocating for violence, that I think the women were all right, the men were all wrong. That's exactly not how I see it. And so I think it's so important not to sensationalize in the language, and that means the descriptions you use, So we just have to be very specific and really careful about which way we describe the people, the victims, the perpetrators. This idea of who is a victim and perpetrator is also a very muddy area in the story, because as we said, the victims were also perpetrators and the perpetrators were also victims, and the whole community in some sense was a perpetrator and a victim. It's really unclear where the boundary lies in this story. So I urge readers, as they're thinking about it, and anyone who wants to write about it afterwards too, or write about these issues, to try to look at not just what happened, but what might it have been like for those people at that time. Don't put we can put our modern lens of, okay, what we know to be, how we know to kind of protect people and what's right. But we have to look at those people and realize they didn't grow up with those same ideas. They didn't have those same protections. What was their life like? And I think if we do that, we can avoid sensationalizing.
Yeah, I totally agree. Your book is really factual, so there's almost like no emotion in it, like conveyed. It's like, oh, poor little women or something like that. Nothing. It's like fact, 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 fact. It's so great. I love it. So if listeners could take away one uncomfortable truth from this conversation, what do you think it should be?
Something that I was curious about, what does it take to kill? This was also a driving question as I was doing my research. I think it can be a bit uncomfortable to say that anyone could be driven in the right circumstances. But I really believe that. I don't think that people are good or bad. I think that acts can be, we should judge the behavior, not the person. And I think that can be a bit uncomfortable. So I think it's important to realize it's uncomfortable when you can't blame somebody. It's uncomfortable when you don't have a villain. And we have to live with that discomfort. And I think if we can live in that in-between gray area, which is uncomfortable, we can't give a definitive answer. Why did they do it? We can't give a definitive answer. Who is to blame? Those are uncomfortable areas to stay in, but we have to do it in order to give justice to the story.
Yeah. Wow. So it's really thought-provoking. The story itself and the book as well, how you wrote it. And I can't emphasize enough that it's an amazing work. And I'm really grateful that you had the time to talk to me about your book. Thanks for being here.
This was such a pleasure, and I really appreciate you reading it and the thoughtful questions. This has actually been really enjoyable for me too, and I'm thinking of things as well as we talk, which is just great.
Oh, wow, nice. Okay, could you please tell our viewers where they can find you on socials?
Yes, you can look me up on Instagram, Hope, HOPE_Reese, my website, hopereese.com. I have a few upcoming events in Budapest that you'll see on there. The book is available online as well. You can see where to order it on my website, or you can put it into Google. It's available in bookstores in Budapest as well as in the UK. So, yep.
Great. Okay, I will write your social thingies in the description box. And one more thing, when can we read it in Hungarian?
Yes, the Hungarian translation should be ready in the fall. We don't have an exact date yet, but in time for the Budapest Book Festival, which will be in October. So I should be there. Yeah.
Okay, great. Can't wait to have it in Hungarian. I mean, in English it's just fantastic, but I'm really eager to see how it unfolds in Hungarian. So thank you everyone for your attention. If you like the video, leave a comment, share, hype. You know the drill. Take care. Bye.
Bye.
Okay, cute. Okay, a few more questions left, and I think this is better than the first one.
Okay, thanks. It's kind of fun that, like, even though I know you probably have, it's funny because I'm kind of thinking of different things as I go along,
It's fine.
Yeah.
That's the whole point.
Right, exactly. Yeah.
Like that.
Yes.
Sorry, can I say bastards?
Yeah.